We are surrounded here by a wonderful exhibition of contemporary art, part of our 800th anniversary celebrations, which I hope, if you're able, you will come and enjoy once the cathedral is again open for visitors and for public worship. I am doing a piece of writing at the moment about the place of art in the cathedral. And my instincts are to come up with something measured and balanced on the one hand, on the other hand, that style that counts as wisdom in our world. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus writes nothing. And when Jesus speaks, then, if Matthew's gospel is to be believed, he is spiky and contrary. Blessed are the meek, he says, for they shall inherit the earth. Really? And he tells parables, not nice morality tales, but pithy short stories spiced with exaggeration and bizarre characters. A farmer who sows seed like confetti. A rich man who pays you the same money whether you work for an hour or for a day. And this morning, another rich man who puts staggering amounts of money in the hands of 3 slaves, leaves no instructions, and goes away without saying when he will be back. It appears to be some kind of test, such as might be set by Lord Sugar, or in an earlier phase of his career, Mr. Trump, in their respective versions of The Apprentice. The first 2 slaves, knowing their master as they do, guess that what is required of them is to put the money to work, be imaginative, take some risks. And when their master returns at last and reckons up, their hunch pays off. But the 3rd slave, knowing his master as he does, can't rise to the challenge. He buries the money, refuses to play the master's game. Perhaps he assumes that whatever game it is, he is bound to lose. And he suffers for his defeatism as he receives the tycoon's jabbing finger. You're fired, with no taxi home afterwards. Now, what does this story mean? Is this what God is like? How does this square with the God our choir just sang about as a refuge in times of crisis? Or how does it square with what Jesus says elsewhere about the kingdom of heaven, which is supposed to belong, he says, to the poor in spirit, rather than sparky entrepreneurs? Or are these not quite the right questions to ask about one of Jesus's short stories? In the nave to my left is one of our pieces of art. In fact, it's a permanent piece, a part of the cathedral's collection. Ernst Blensdorf's Annunciation. It's a beautiful piece in elmwood. But what does it mean? There's nothing to tell you how to see it beyond that one-word title, Annunciation. The title recalls the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary the birth of Jesus. But is the figure Mary, or is it the angel? Those flowing, expansive hands, are they offering something or receiving something? Instead of asking what a piece of art means, instead, notice what it does to you, what it draws out of you. Notice what echoes it finds in you, how it makes you feel. Art is what art does. It unlocks imagination. And in the same way, Jesus' short stories mean what they do. So instead of expecting this morning's story to tell us everything about the character of God, let's ask instead, what does this story do to me? What echoes does it find in me? How does it make me feel? Let it unlock your imagination. We can't know how this story struck the first people to hear Matthew's Gospel, but I suspect it would have got them thinking not about the timeless character of God, but about an event, the echoes of which reverberated in their lives. In AD 66, the Jewish nation had risen against its Roman overlords, and it did not end well. Within 4 years, Jerusalem had fallen, and the temple, the place where God's glory dwelt, was destroyed. That sent a shudder of thought through the Jewish world, and it was hard not to see it as a judgment, a reckoning. God had entrusted great things to the religious elite of the day, the people Jesus berates elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel. But, like the useless slave in our story, they had misused it. They hadn't risen to the challenge, and they had lost it all. Others had come through that testing time much better. Jewish faith in Palestine rediscovered itself, worshipping God and loving neighbour in local communities of belief focused on scripture, synagogue and rabbi. And a particular Jewish sect called the Christians grew and grew. They looked for God's presence not in a now vanished temple, but in an executed criminal who they believed was with them whenever 2 or 3 of them gathered. The secret was to respond to God's generosity, to use well what had been entrusted to them. What echoes do you find in the story? We've come to the end of a season of remembrance like no other. But the familiar echoes have been there, memories of lives lived and lives lost in wars that brought the fall of empires and tested whole societies. There were reckonings then too. Some things were swept away, other things endured, and new possibilities emerged. Equal votes for men and women in the decade after the First World War. And after the Second, as the Dean described in last Sunday's sermon, an assault on the 5 giants, as they were called, of want, squalor, idleness, ignorance, and disease. I am also struck about how the exhausting crucible of war generated such extraordinary charitable energies. The Save the Children Fund was founded in 1919 and Oxfam in 1942, in the very depth of war. Christian Aid was founded amid the ruins of 1945. Times of testing that unlocked people's, or some people's, imagination for good and for justice. What echoes do you find in our story? Well, this is not 1942. There are no air raids, no rationing, but we face our own times of testing in lost jobs and businesses, in 50,000 lost lives, and there will be a reckoning up. Indeed, it may already have begun, a judgment upon leaders and governments, and also upon the church, upon you and me. Have you used well what has been entrusted to you. At the moment, our bishops are meeting representatives from each of the 400 plus parishes in the Diocese of Salisbury. We're doing it on Zoom. The pandemic has certainly unlocked our technological imagination. And part of each session is a short film called Beyond the Present. There will be a link to the film when this sermon goes online. And the film shows how churches in the diocese are striving to worship God and love their neighbour in these unprecedented times. Its controlling message is some words of St. Paul, which offer armour against defeatism. Paul says, suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us. Looking beyond this present time of testing, Karen, Bishop of Sherborne, in the film, poses 4 questions. What have we lost that we value? What have we lost that we haven't really missed? What have we taken on that was just for a season? And what have we gained that we must not lose? These are really ways of asking the question that today's parable puts to us. How well are we using what has been entrusted to us? All good questions for the church, good questions for the society that we serve in God's name. How we respond, either with defeatism or with imagination and hope, that will determine whether the words of the Master will be for us to hear. Well done, good and faithful servant.